The compound sat like a scar on the mountainside, concrete and steel carved into rock where no roads dared venture. For 11 years, Victor Lazarev had made it his fortress, and for 11 years the world had learned to look away. He wasn't just untouchable. He was a myth wrapped in titanium plating and surface-to-air missiles. Drug routes stretched across 3 continents under his command. Politicians whispered his name in locked rooms. Intelligence agencies had thick files they never opened. The last team sent to observe his operation had returned in body bags. Their convoy ambushed 40 kilometers from the target. After that, the international community had quietly decided that some monsters were better left sleeping. But Victor's mistake wasn't being too powerful. It was believing his own legend. The briefing room at Incirlik Air Base smelled like burnt coffee and tension. Major Alina Kovic stood at the back, arms crossed, watching the mission planners argue over satellite imagery. She'd been flying A-10 Warthogs for 14 years, earned 3 distinguished flying crosses, and logged more combat hours than anyone in the squadron. But when she walked into rooms like this, she still felt the weight of being dismissed. The young intelligence officer at the front was explaining why the mission was impossible. Too many SAM sites, too much mountainous terrain, no viable approach vector. Victor's compound had been designed by former Soviet military engineers who understood how to make something impregnable. The phrase "acceptable losses" kept appearing in the slides. Alina had stopped listening after the 3rd time someone suggested a drone strike that would inevitably kill dozens of civilians in the nearby valley. "There's always a way in," she said quietly. The room didn't hear her at first. She'd learned years ago that her voice didn't carry the same weight as the men around her, even when she was saying the exact thing they needed to hear. She repeated herself, louder this time. The intelligence officer turned, his expression hovering between irritation and curiosity. Her call sign was stitched onto her flight suit, Viper. Most people thought it was because of her aggressive flying style. They were wrong, but she'd stopped correcting them years ago. The real story was locked in a classified file from her first deployment, a night mission over the Hindu Kush where she'd pulled 3 Marines out of a kill box that every other pilot had declared unreachable. The Marines had given her the name. It stuck. "Major Kovic," the colonel leading the briefing said, not unkindly, "we've run the simulations. The approach is—" She stepped forward, her boots measured against the linoleum. "Respectfully, sir, your simulations assume a conventional attack profile. They assume we're going to announce ourselves." She reached the table, placed one finger on the satellite image. "But what if we don't?" The valley below Victor's compound was famous for 2 things: unpredictable thermal currents that made flying suicidal, and a layer of morning fog so thick it turned the mountains into ghosts. Every tactical assessment had written off a low-altitude approach because of these factors. Alina saw them differently. The thermals weren't obstacles, they were cover. The fog wasn't a hazard, it was camouflage. She'd spent the last 3 years studying close air support doctrine, reading after-action reports from pilots who'd pushed A-10s into situations the aircraft wasn't technically rated for and survived. The Warthog wasn't elegant. It was blunt force wrapped in titanium bathtubs, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying. It was slow, ungainly, built around a rotary cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds capable of shredding tanks. Most modern air forces had tried to retire it a dozen times, but there was no replacement for what it did. Low, slow, precise devastation delivered by pilots willing to fly into hell itself. The planners listened as she outlined the approach. A pre-dawn insertion, riding the thermal layer at 200 feet, using the canyon system to mask her radar signature. Victor's SAM sites were oriented for high-altitude threats, cruise missiles, fighter bombers, the kind of precision strikes that military powers typically deployed. Nobody expected an attack from below, from the fog itself, delivered by a single pilot in an aircraft that looked like it belonged in a museum. The intelligence officer raised the obvious objection. Even if she reached the compound, Victor's personal guard numbered over 50, all former Special Forces operatives from half a dozen countries. The compound had redundant power systems, reinforced bunkers, escape tunnels that led deep into the mountain. "You'd need to neutralize the entire infrastructure simultaneously," he said. "One pilot, one aircraft. It's a suicide run." Alina met his eyes. "Then it's a good thing I'm not planning to die." The room fell silent. The colonel studied her for a long moment, then looked at the satellite imagery again. She could see him running calculations, weighing acceptable risk against the political nightmare of doing nothing. Victor had recently executed a journalist who'd been investigating his operations, posting the video online as a warning. International pressure was mounting. Something had to be done, even if that something was insane. "You'll have one chance," the colonel said finally. "Miss the target window and you abort. No heroics, no second passes. Understood?" She nodded. Heroics were for people who didn't understand the cost. She understood perfectly. The mission was scheduled for 72 hours out. Alina spent the time preparing in the way she always did, systematic, methodical, leaving nothing to chance. She walked the flight line at dawn, inspecting her aircraft with the kind of attention that made the ground crew nervous. The A-10 assigned to her, tail number 8010964, had been in service since before she was born. Its titanium bathtub had scars from small arms fire acquired over 2 decades of deployments. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the rivets and patches, the history written in metal. Some pilots talked to their aircraft. She didn't. But she listened, checking every control surface, every hydraulic line, every round loaded into the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. 7 barrels, 30mm, 4,000 rounds per minute. The sound it made was often compared to a thunderclap or a zipper tearing through reality. She'd fired it in combat enough times to know it was both. Her wingman for the mission was Captain Marcus Webb, call sign Hammer, a solid pilot with good instincts and a tendency to follow orders without questioning them. They'd flown together before, though never on anything this surgical. During the final briefing, he kept glancing at her, trying to read whether she actually believed this would work or if she was just too proud to back down. She didn't give him anything. Confidence was a performance, and she'd been performing it long enough that sometimes even she couldn't tell where the act ended and the truth began. The night before the mission, she sat in her quarters and wrote a letter she'd never send. It wasn't for anyone specific, just words on paper, a way of organizing thoughts that couldn't be spoken aloud. She wrote about her father, a cargo pilot who taught her to fly in a beat-up Cessna when she was 12. He died when she was 19, his plane going down in a storm over the North Atlantic. She joined the Air Force 6 months later, driven by something she still couldn't fully articulate. Grief, maybe, or the need to prove that flying didn't have to end in tragedy. She sealed the letter in an envelope and left it in her locker. If she didn't come back, someone would find it eventually. If she did come back, she'd burn it. Either way, the words had served their purpose. At 0300 hours, the alarm pulled her from a sleep too light to be called rest. She dressed in silence, pulling on her flight suit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The base was quiet, pre-dawn darkness broken only by scattered lights and the distant sound of a cargo plane taxiing. The operations building was lit like a cathedral, staffed by people who wouldn't sleep until she was back on the ground or confirmed dead. The intelligence officer from the initial briefing was there, looking haggard. He'd spent the last 72 hours refining the target package, identifying vulnerabilities in Victor's defenses, calculating blast patterns and collateral damage probabilities. When he saw her, he handed over a tablet with the final mission data. "His security team rotates at 0530, he said. "That's your window. After that, they'll be at full alert for the next 6 hours. Alina took the tablet, scanning the updated imagery. Victor's compound was a complex target, 3 main structures, underground bunkers, vehicle depots, and a helipad that had seen recent activity. Intelligence suggested he was planning to move soon, relocating to another site deeper in the mountains. If they didn't hit him now, he'd vanish for another decade. "What about civilians?" she asked. The intelligence officer hesitated. There's a village 3 clicks east. Early warning systems might trigger evacuations if they detect inbound aircraft. She nodded. Might. The word carried the weight of all the things that could go wrong. I'll be below their radar threshold, she said. He didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. At 0400, she walked to the flight line with Marcus. The air was cool, desert wind carrying the smell of jet fuel and dust. Her A-10 sat waiting, weapons loaded, fuel tanks topped off. The ground crew chief, a master sergeant named Ramirez who'd been turning wrenches longer than she'd been flying, gave her a thumbs up. No speeches, no dramatic send-offs, just work. She climbed into the cockpit, the familiar ritual of strapping in and running pre-flight checks grounding her in the present moment. Outside, Marcus was settling into his own aircraft, his Warthog parked 30 meters away. They'd fly in loose formation until they reached the target area, then she'd go in alone while he stayed high, ready to suppress any air defenses that woke up. The radio crackled. Viper hammer, comms check. His voice was steady, professional. She keyed her mic. Hammer, Viper. Good copy. Ready for startup. They ran through the checks together, 2 pilots in 2 aging aircraft about to fly into a situation that most military planners had deemed impossible. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, twin turbofans that gave the A-10 just enough speed to stay airborne while carrying an absurd amount of ordnance. She felt the vibration through the stick, the aircraft coming alive beneath her hands. At 0420, Tower cleared them for takeoff. Marcus went first, his Warthog lumbering down the runway before lifting into the darkness. Alina followed, throttle forward, airspeed building, the moment of rotation smooth and familiar. The ground fell away. The base lights became stars below, and then there was only sky, darkness, and the mission ahead. They flew east, staying low, following terrain features that kept them off radar. The pre-dawn world was painted in shades of gray, mountains rising like frozen waves, valleys cutting deep into the earth. Alina kept her scan moving. Instruments, horizon, threat display, fuel. Flying at 200 feet didn't leave room for daydreaming. One moment of inattention could put her into a ridgeline. The A-10 wasn't forgiving of mistakes, but it was honest. It told you exactly what it was doing, no surprises, no hidden flight characteristics that only appeared in emergencies. She trusted that honesty more than she trusted most people. 40 minutes into the flight, they reached the initial point. Marcus climbed to his holding pattern at 8,000 feet while Alina descended further, following the canyon system that would take her to Victor's compound. The fog was starting to form, exactly as predicted, thermal layers rising from the valley floor to meet the cooler mountain air. She slipped into it, the world contracting to instruments and instinct. Visibility dropped to near zero. She was flying on terrain-following radar, and a map she'd memorized so thoroughly she could have drawn it blind. The radio stayed silent. No chatter, no updates, just the discipline of professionals who knew that every transmission was a potential compromise. She checked her weapons panel, Maverick missiles armed, cannon ready, targeting pod online. The compound was 12 minutes out. Victor was probably still asleep, surrounded by his guards, confident in the fortress he'd built. He'd claimed no one would dare attack him. He'd been right for 11 years. Alina wondered if he'd ever considered that his greatest protection, being too dangerous to touch, could also be his greatest vulnerability. When you stop expecting threats, you stop preparing for them. She'd seen it before in targets that had grown complacent, warlords who'd forgotten that invincibility was always temporary. At the 8-minute mark, her threat display flickered. A SAM site had gone active, sweeping the valley with search radar. She stayed low, letting the terrain mask her signature. The radar beam passed overhead, hunting for threats that flew where normal aircraft flew. She wasn't normal, neither was her mission. At the 5-minute mark, the fog began to thin. She could see the valley floor now, scattered vegetation and dirt roads that led nowhere. The compound would be ahead, nestled against the mountainside where the engineers had promised it would be invisible to conventional attack. She armed her weapons, a final check of systems that needed to work perfectly on the first try. There would be no second chances. Victor's guards would scatter, Sam's sights would come alive, and she'd be flying through a sky full of metal trying to kill her. The key was speed and surprise. Hit them before they knew she was there, hit them hard enough that response became irrelevant. At the 2-minute mark, she saw it. The compound emerged from the fog like a concrete tumor, exactly where the satellite imagery had placed it. 3 structures, guard towers, the helipad with 2 helicopters parked in the open. She could see movement below, figures walking perimeter routes, routine patrols that didn't expect anything unusual. She pulled up slightly, gaining just enough altitude for her targeting pod to lock on. The Maverick missiles were fire and forget, but that didn't mean she could be careless. She designated targets with surgical precision. Bunker entrances first, then the power generation facility, then the main residence where intelligence believed Victor slept. Time compressed. Her thumb found the weapon's release. The first Maverick dropped away, motor igniting, white smoke trail cutting through the fog. Then the second. Then the third. She was already pulling into her gun run when the missiles impacted. The explosions were simultaneous, massive, tearing into reinforced concrete with shaped charges designed to penetrate bunkers. Secondary explosions followed as fuel and ammunition cooked off. The compound disappeared behind clouds of smoke and debris. She rolled in with the cannon, squeezing the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, a sound that made her bones vibrate, rounds chewing through vehicles and structures with indifferent precision. She walked the burst across the helipad, watched both helicopters disintegrate under the impacts. 3 seconds of fire, then she was pulling up, afterburners lighting, climbing back into the fog as the SAM sights finally woke up. Her threat display lit up like a Christmas tree. Missiles launching, tracking systems trying to find her. Victor's supposedly impregnable defenses realizing too late that they'd been compromised from an angle they'd never considered. Marcus's voice crackled over the radio. Viper hammer, multiple SAM launches, break right and climb. She was already doing it, pulling hard, the A-10 groaning under the G-forces. A missile streaked past her canopy, missing by meters, its proximity fuse failing to detonate because she'd turned inside its engagement parameters. Another followed, this one tracking better. She dumped flares, chaff, everything the Warthog carried to confuse incoming threats. The missile locked onto a flare, detonated in a flash of light that left spots in her vision. She kept climbing, kept turning, trusting the titanium bathtub to stop anything that got through her countermeasures. Below, the compound was burning. Massive fires, secondary explosions, structures collapsing. She keyed her radio. Hammer Viper, target destroyed. Winchester on Mavericks coming to you. Winchester meant she'd expended her missiles. The cannon still had rounds, but the primary mission was complete. Marcus acknowledged, his voice tight with concentration. He was tracking the SAM launches, ready to suppress them if they got too close. But Alina was already in the clear, diving back into the valley, using speed and terrain to break the targeting solutions. The SAM sights were dangerous, but they were designed for targets that flew predictable patterns. She was neither predictable nor following any pattern they'd programmed for. 5 minutes later, she rejoined with Marcus at the holding point. They turned west, climbing to altitude, the compound falling behind them. The sun was rising now, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Beautiful, she thought distantly. The world kept being beautiful even when you just turned part of it into rubble. The flight back to Incirlik was quiet, both pilots monitoring fuel and systems, processing what had just happened. Alina felt the familiar post-mission crash starting, adrenaline draining away, leaving her hollow and exhausted. But there was also satisfaction, cold and professional. The mission had worked. Victor's fortress was gone. Whether Victor himself was dead remained to be seen, but his infrastructure, his protection, his myth, all of it was shattered. At 0615, they touched down at Incirlik. The ground crew was waiting, along with the colonel and half the operations staff. Alina shut down her engines, went through the post-flight checklist with mechanical precision, then climbed out of the cockpit. Her legs were shaky. 14 years of flying, and she still got the shakes after missions like this. The colonel approached, his expression unreadable. Preliminary reports confirm target destruction, he said. We're waiting for confirmation on Victor himself, but the compound is gone, completely. Alina nodded. She wanted to feel triumphant, but mostly she felt tired. Any civilian casualties, she asked. None reported. The village was outside the blast radius. You put the ordnance exactly where it needed to go. That was something, at least. The intelligence officer appeared, looking relieved and slightly awed. We're already picking up chatter on Victor's networks, he said. Complete chaos. His organization is fragmenting without the central command structure. It's going to take years for anyone to rebuild what you destroyed in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That's how long she'd been over the target, from first missile impact to breaking off the gun run. 3 minutes to dismantle 11 years of invincibility. She thought about Victor if he'd survived, what he must be thinking. His fortress, his protection, his carefully constructed immunity, all of it torn apart by a single pilot in an aircraft most people considered obsolete. The myth of untouchability had died this morning, burned away in fire and titanium rain. The debriefing took 4 hours. They wanted every detail: approach vector, weapons effectiveness, threat reactions, split-second decisions that had kept her alive. Marcus corroborated everything, his account matching hers perfectly. By the time they finished, the intelligence community had confirmed it. Victor Lazarev was dead, killed in the initial missile strike, his body found in the rubble of his residence. The Mafia boss who'd claimed no one dared attack him had died without ever knowing what hit him. News of the strike spread quickly, through intelligence channels and then into the broader military community. The impossible mission that had worked. The female pilot who'd flown into the Valley of Death and emerged unscathed. Alina's name started appearing in classified reports, in briefings at the Pentagon, in conversations between generals who were reassessing what they thought they knew about A-10 capabilities. But she didn't hear most of that. She was in her quarters, finally allowed to sleep, the letter she'd written still sealed in her locker. She'd burn it tomorrow. Tonight, she just needed to close her eyes and let the world stop spinning. She dreamed of flying, the way she always did after missions. But this time there was no fog, no mountains, no targets. Just open sky, endless and blue, the kind of sky her father had taught her to love before the world had complicated everything. She woke 12 hours later to find that her phone had been flooded with messages. Squadron mates congratulating her. Pilots she'd never met asking about the approach. The public affairs office requesting an interview she absolutely would not give. Fame was dangerous. It made you a symbol instead of a person, and symbols couldn't fly aircraft. She deleted most of the messages and went to the mess hall. Marcus found her there, eating breakfast at 0:30, her internal clock still scrambled. They're calling it the Viper Strike, he said, sitting down across from her. Some journalist got hold of the basic details, wrote it up for a defense blog. It's already viral, she grimaced. Of course it was. The story was too good. Lone pilot, impossible target, devastating success. People loved that narrative, especially when it involved weapons that went bang and a protagonist who defied expectations. Are they using my name? She asked. Just your call sign, and the fact that you're, he hesitated. Female, she finished. Yeah, that's the angle everyone wants. Marcus looked uncomfortable. He was a good pilot, a good man, but he'd never had to navigate the particular minefield of being competent while female in a community that still wasn't entirely sure women belonged in cockpits. For what it's worth, he said, you earned every bit of credit you're getting. That mission was brilliant. Insane, but brilliant. She appreciated the sentiment even if it didn't change anything. Credit was nice, but it wouldn't make the next briefing room listen to her any faster. It wouldn't stop the subtle dismissals, the assumptions that she'd gotten lucky rather than being skilled. Some of her squadron mates would be genuinely impressed. Others would find ways to diminish what she'd done, because the alternative was admitting they might not have had the nerve to try. Over the next few days, Alina watched the aftermath unfold. Victor's criminal empire collapsed in spectacular fashion, rival factions turning on each other, authorities moving in to seize assets and arrest lieutenants. The journalist's family, the one Victor had executed, released a statement thanking the unnamed pilot who delivered justice. It should have felt good. Mostly it felt complicated. The A-10 community was small, tight-knit, and generally resistant to outsiders. But the Viper strike had done something unexpected. It had reminded everyone what the aircraft could do in the right hands. For years, there had been talk of retiring the Warthog, replacing it with newer multi-role fighters that cost 10 times as much and couldn't loiter over battlefields the way an A-10 could. Alina's mission became Exhibit A in arguments for keeping the fleet operational. She wasn't sure how she felt about becoming a poster child for a weapons system, but it was better than obscurity. A week after the mission, she was summoned to the wing commander's office. General Patricia Carmichael was a former fighter pilot who'd flown F-16s during Desert Storm, a woman who'd risen through ranks that hadn't made it easy. She looked at Alina with the kind of scrutiny that saw through performance and straight to the truth beneath. "They want to give you a medal," Carmichael said without preamble. "Silver Star, probably. Maybe higher if the politicians get involved." Alina kept her face neutral. Medals were complicated. They meant recognition, but they also meant publicity interviews, a spotlight she didn't want. "I did my job, ma'am," she said. "That's what the medal is for. Doing the job when the job is extremely dangerous and most people wouldn't have the skill or courage to attempt it." Carmichael leaned back in her chair. "I read your file. 3 DFCs, 2 Bronze Stars, more combat hours than pilots twice your age. You're one of the best stick-and-rudder aviators in the Air Force, and you're consistently overlooked for command positions. Why do you think that is?" The question was direct, clinical, inviting honesty. "Because I don't fit the image," Alina said. "And because every time I prove I'm competent, the goalposts move." Carmichael nodded slowly. "That's going to change. This mission, it's the kind of thing that forces people to pay attention. You've got visibility now, whether you want it or not. The question is what you do with it." Alina considered that. Visibility could be a weapon or a target depending on how you handled it. "I keep flying," she said. "I train the next generation. I make sure the mission always comes first." The general smiled, thin and approving. "Good answer, because here's what's coming: congressional testimony about A-10 effectiveness. Defense contractor briefings, media requests you'll have to deflect through public affairs, and every pilot who's ever doubted you will be watching to see if you stumble." It sounded exhausting. It also sounded inevitable. Alina left the general's office with orders to report to the Pentagon in 2 weeks. She'd give a classified briefing on the mission, strictly for senior leadership and strategic planners. No media, no public spectacle, just professionals discussing what had worked and why. She could handle that. What she couldn't handle, or didn't want to, was the growing legend around the Viper strike. Stories had a way of mutating, becoming larger and less true with each retelling. She'd already heard versions where she'd single-handedly fought off a dozen SAM sites, where Victor had died in a dramatic gun run instead of a missile strike, where she delivered a one-liner over the radio that she'd never actually said. Myths were useful, but they weren't real. And eventually, people started believing the myth more than the truth. Marcus found her on the flight line one evening, watching maintenance crews service her A-10. "You okay?" he asked. "Just thinking," she said. About what happens when you become more valuable as a symbol than as a pilot." He didn't have an answer for that. Nobody did. The Air Force needed heroes, needed stories that justified budgets and recruitment campaigns. She'd become one whether she wanted to or not. The Pentagon briefing was exactly what she expected. A room full of flag officers and senior civilians who wanted to know how a mission they deemed impossible had succeeded. Alina walked them through it methodically, using maps and telemetry data, explaining the approach vector, the weapons employment, the risk calculations that had informed every decision. They listened with the kind of attention that suggested they were already thinking about applications beyond one target in one valley. "Could this tactics package be replicated?" a 2-star general asked. "Against similar hardened targets?" Alina considered the question carefully. "With the right pilot, the right aircraft, and the right intelligence, yes, but it's not something you'd want to standardize. Every target is unique. The specific conditions that made this work, the fog, the terrain, Victor's overconfidence, Those won't be present everywhere. The general nodded, but she could see he was already thinking about doctrine, about turning her improvisation into teachable tactics. That was how militaries worked. They took individual brilliance and tried to systematize it with mixed results. After the briefing, she was cornered by a colonel from Air Combat Command. "We're updating the A-10 syllabus," he said, "including case studies from recent operations. Your mission is going to be one of them." Teaching tool, she thought. Her 3 minutes over Victor's compound would be dissected by student pilots for years, analyzed for lessons about terrain masking and weapons employment. It was immortality of a sort, her decisions preserved in training manuals long after she'd stopped flying. The medal ceremony happened 3 months later, low-key by military standards, just her squadron and some senior leadership. They pinned the silver star to her uniform while a photographer documented the moment for official records. Alina stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal and everything it represented. Recognition, yes, but also expectation. She was a role model now, whether she'd asked for that role or not. Young female pilots would look at her career and see possibility. That was worth something, even if it felt like pressure. After the ceremony, pilots from other squadrons approached her, some with genuine respect, others with thinly veiled skepticism. One captain, a weapons school graduate with a spotless record and obvious opinions about women in combat roles, asked her point-blank if she thought she'd been lucky. "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity," she said evenly. "I was prepared. The opportunity presented itself." "You can call that lucky if it makes you feel better." His jaw tightened, but he didn't press the issue. She'd learned long ago that some people would never be convinced, and arguing with them was wasted energy. Her reputation would speak for itself, one mission at a time. The years that followed were busy. Alina flew combat missions in 3 different theaters, trained new pilots in close air support tactics, and quietly accumulated a record that made her indispensable. The Viper strike remained her most famous operation, but it wasn't her only one. She pulled off rescues that shouldn't have worked, destroyed targets that other pilots had missed, and developed a reputation for bringing her aircraft home no matter how much battle damage it sustained. The A-10 community, that tight circle of warthog drivers who understood what the aircraft could do, came to regard her as something close to a saint. When the Air Force finally made her a squadron commander, it felt both overdue and revolutionary. She was the first woman to lead an A-10 squadron, a milestone that would have gotten more attention if she hadn't deliberately downplayed it. The job was what mattered, not the symbolism. Under her command, the squadron became one of the highest-performing units in the Air Force, with mission success rates that made other commanders envious. She trained her pilots the way she flew, meticulously, aggressively, with zero tolerance for carelessness. They learned to think like her, to see opportunities where others saw obstacles, to trust their aircraft and their skills in equal measure. Some of them thrived. Others washed out. She didn't apologize for having standards. Victor Lazarev's empire, or what remained of it, never recovered. The power vacuum created by his death had sparked a war among his former lieutenants, and law enforcement agencies across 3 continents had seized the opportunity to dismantle networks that had operated with impunity for over a decade. Interpol estimated that the Viper strike had indirectly led to over 200 arrests and the seizure of assets worth billions. Alina never thought much about that. She'd been focused on the mission, not the geopolitical implications. But others kept score, and her actions had echoes that rippled far beyond one destroyed compound. 10 years after the strike, a documentary crew requested an interview. They were making a film about precision military operations, and the Viper strike was one of their case studies. Alina declined. She'd never been comfortable with media attention, and a decade hadn't changed that. But Marcus agreed to be interviewed, and when she watched the finished documentary, she was surprised by what he'd said. "People ask me what it was like flying with Viper," he told the camera. "And I tell them it was like watching someone operate on a level most pilots never reach. She didn't just fly the aircraft, she thought in 3 dimensions, saw possibilities nobody else saw. That mission worked because she understood something fundamental. Invincibility is an illusion. And illusions break when you hit them hard enough. The documentary went viral, racked up millions of views, spawned dozens of breakdown videos analyzing the tactics and strategy. Alina's call sign became synonymous with precision and daring, studied in military academies and discussed in strategy seminars. She remained uncomfortable with the attention, but she'd stopped fighting it. This was her legacy, whether she liked it or not. In her late 50s, Alina finally retired from active duty. Her body had accumulated the wear that came from flying high-performance aircraft for 3 decades, back problems, hearing loss, joints that ached when weather fronts moved through. But her mind was still sharp, her insights still valuable. The Air Force hired her as a civilian consultant, analyzing tactics and advising on doctrine. She spent her days doing what she'd always done, finding ways to accomplish missions that seemed impossible. Young pilots still sought her out, asking for advice, for stories, for some secret that would make them as good as she'd been. She always gave them the same answer. There were no secrets, just hard work and a willingness to see the world differently than everyone else. Viktor Lazarev thought he was untouchable, she'd tell them. And he was right until he wasn't. That's the lesson. Nothing is impossible, you just have to be willing to try. The A-10 Warthog, that ungainly aircraft that nobody wanted to retire, kept flying for another generation. Every pilot who strapped into its cockpit knew about the Viper strike, knew about the woman who'd turned an obsolete airframe into a precision instrument of impossible missions. The aircraft became a symbol of persistence, of refusing to quit even when newer and shinier alternatives existed. Alina liked that. She'd never been the flashiest pilot, just the most determined. On the 20th anniversary of the mission, a small ceremony was held at Incirlik Air Base. The compound where Viktor had lived was now a memorial park, established by the governments whose citizens had suffered under his regime. Alina attended quietly, standing among veterans and dignitaries, listening to speeches about justice and courage. She didn't give a speech herself. She'd never been good with words, at least not the kind that sounded impressive in public forums. But afterward, a young Air Force captain approached her, a woman with pilot wings and the kind of nervous energy that Alina recognized from her own early career. "Ma'am," the captain said, "I'm flying A-10s because of you, because of what you proved could be done." Alina studied her for a moment. The captain's eyes held determination and hope in equal measure, the expression of someone who'd been told she didn't belong and had decided to prove otherwise. "Then prove it every day," Alina said. "Not because you're representing anyone but yourself, not because you're trying to change minds, but because the mission demands your best and anything less is unacceptable." The captain nodded, that message landing with the weight of truth. She saluted, crisp and precise, and walked away. Alina watched her go, seeing in that young pilot all the battles still to be fought, all the doubters still to be proven wrong. But she also saw possibility, the potential for excellence that transcended gender or expectation or any of the artificial barriers people constructed. The sky didn't care who flew through it. It only cared about skill and courage and the will to keep pushing boundaries. Alina had spent her career proving that, one mission at a time. And the pilots coming after her would continue that work, standing on the foundation she'd helped build. The Viper strike had been 3 minutes of violence in a foggy valley, but its impact had rippled across decades. Not because it was the most complex mission or the most dangerous, but because it had shattered an illusion, the belief that some targets were untouchable, some barriers unbreakable, some pilots unworthy of trust. Viktor Lazarev had built his fortress in the mountains and declared himself beyond reach. He'd been wrong. And in being wrong, he'd become a lesson that echoed through military academies and strategy sessions, a cautionary tale about the danger of believing your own legend. Alina had never claimed to be legendary. She'd just been a pilot who saw a problem and found a solution, who trusted her training and her instincts, who refused to accept that impossible meant inevitable. That had been enough. It would always be enough. As she stood in that memorial park, watching the sun set over mountains that had once hidden a criminal empire, Alina felt something close to peace. The nightmares from her early deployments had faded years ago. The doubt that had plagued her career had given way to certainty, earned through thousands of hours and dozens of missions where she'd proven herself again and again. She'd never sought fame or recognition, but she'd earned respect, the kind that mattered from people who understood what she'd accomplished. The rest was just noise, the inevitable mythology that grew around successful operations. The truth was simpler and more profound. She'd been a good pilot. She'd served with honor. She'd opened doors that had been closed and made it easier for those who came after. That was legacy enough. The sky above the memorial was clear and endless, the kind of sky that had always called to her, even before she understood why. She'd spent most of her life answering that call, chasing horizons and pushing limits, living in the thin boundary between Earth and space where only pilots dwelled. It had cost her relationships, normalcy, the kind of life most people took for granted. But she'd never regretted it. How could she? She'd touched something transcendent, had felt the pure joy of flight distilled into moments of clarity where nothing existed except the aircraft and the mission and her own absolute conviction that she could succeed. Those moments were worth everything she'd sacrificed. They were worth the doubt and the struggle and the years of being underestimated. They were worth the weight of legacy she now carried, the responsibility of being someone others looked up to. As the ceremony concluded and people began to leave, Alina took one last look at the mountains. Somewhere beneath them, buried under soil and time, were the ruins of Victor's fortress. Nature was reclaiming it, erosion and vegetation slowly erasing the evidence of his hubris. In another generation it would be gone entirely, just another forgotten ruin in an ancient landscape. But the lesson would remain. The story would persist. And pilots would keep flying into impossible situations, trusting their skills and their aircraft, refusing to accept that anything was truly beyond reach. Alina walked back to the rental car, her steps measured and sure, carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every scar and every triumph. She'd been called Viper for most of her adult life, that name given by Marines who'd needed her to be something more than human, something fierce and unstoppable. She'd lived up to it, not because she wanted to be feared, but because the mission required excellence and she'd refused to deliver anything less. Now, in the evening of her career, she could finally see the full shape of what she'd built. Not just a record of successful missions, but a template for those who came after. She'd shown that competence transcended assumption, that skill mattered more than expectation, that the only limits that truly mattered were the ones you accepted for yourself. Victor Lazarev had accepted no limits, had believed himself untouchable, and had paid the ultimate price for that arrogance. Alina had accepted different limits, the laws of physics, the capabilities of her aircraft, the boundaries of human endurance, and had learned to operate masterfully within them. That was the difference between hubris and confidence, between myth and reality, between a fortress that crumbled and a legacy that endured. The Mafia boss had claimed no one dared attack him. He'd been right until he was catastrophically wrong. And the pilot who proved him wrong had done so not with bravado or theatrics, but with calculated precision, and the courage to attempt what everyone else declared impossible. Years from now, when historians wrote about 21st century aerial warfare, the Viper strike would merit a footnote, maybe a paragraph. The details would be sanitized, the human element reduced to tactical analysis. But the pilots would remember. They always remembered the missions that mattered, the ones that pushed boundaries and redefined what was possible. They'd remember the female pilot who flew into the fog and emerged victorious, who turned an aging airframe into a weapon of surgical precision, who refused to accept that some targets were untouchable. They'd remember because the story offered something precious: hope. Hope that skill could overcome disadvantage, that determination could defeat doubt, that excellence was achievable regardless of the obstacles in your path. Alina had never intended to be inspirational. She just wanted to fly to serve, to prove she belonged in a cockpit as much as any man. But intention mattered less than impact, and her impact had been profound. She'd changed the conversation, shifted perceptions, made it easier for the next generation to claim their place in the sky. That was worth more than medals or accolades or viral documentaries. That was the kind of legacy that actually mattered. As she drove away from the memorial, Alina thought about the letter she'd written before the mission, the one she'd burned after returning safely. She'd written many such letters over the years, each one a hedge against mortality, a way of organizing thoughts too complex to carry into combat. She'd burned them all. But the sentiments they contained, the acknowledgement of fear, the acceptance of risk, the love for flying that transcended rational explanation, those were permanent. They'd shaped every decision she'd made, every mission she'd flown, every boundary she'd pushed. Fear and courage weren't opposites. They were partners, twin forces that drove you to prepare meticulously, to calculate odds precisely, to execute flawlessly when the moment demanded action. Viktor Lazarev had felt no fear because he'd insulated himself from consequence. That had been his fatal weakness. Alina had felt fear before every dangerous mission and had flown anyway, not despite the fear but because of it, because fear meant you understood the stakes and chose to act anyway. The sky didn't care about your feelings. It only cared about your choices. And she'd chosen to fly toward threats when others flew away, to attempt missions deemed impossible, to prove that competence and courage could overcome any obstacle. The sun was setting as she reached the airport, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Alina paused before entering the terminal, taking one last moment to appreciate the view. She'd seen thousands of sunsets from thousands of cockpits, each one unique, each one beautiful in its own way. This one, viewed from the ground, felt different, elegiac maybe, or simply peaceful. She was no longer the pilot who flew into foggy valleys hunting criminals. She was something else now, something quieter but no less important. A teacher, a consultant, a living repository of hard-won experience. The missions would continue, flown by pilots she'd trained, using tactics she'd refined, building on the foundation she'd helped construct. Viktor Lazarev's compound was gone, reduced to rubble and memory. But what Alina had built, a legacy of excellence, a pathway for others, proof that impossible was just another word for difficult, that would endure. Not because of one mission, but because of a career spent refusing to accept limitations imposed by others. She'd been underestimated, dismissed, doubted, and she'd responded by being undeniably, inarguably excellent. That was her final lesson, the one she hoped every pilot who learned about the Viper strike would understand. Don't waste energy fighting perceptions. Just be so good they can't ignore you. The aircraft that had carried her into combat, tail number 810964, was still flying. She'd checked on it periodically, tracking its assignments through the kind of informal network that only exists among people who share a deep connection to specific machines. The Warthog had outlasted predictions of its retirement, had survived political attempts to mothball the fleet, had proven time and again that there was no replacement for what it did. Alina liked to think she'd contributed to that survival. The Viper strike had given politicians and generals a concrete example of A-10 effectiveness, ammunition for budget battles and strategic debates. The aircraft had saved her life in combat, and she'd returned the favor by helping save its future. That seemed like a fair exchange. As she boarded her flight home, commercial this time, no stick, no throttle, just a passenger seat and a magazine she wouldn't read, Alina reflected on the strange arc of her career. She joined the Air Force to honor her father, to transform grief into purpose. She'd stayed because flying gave her life meaning, because the challenge of mastering an aircraft and a mission provided a clarity she'd never found anywhere else. She'd excelled because she'd refused to accept that competence should be surprising, that her gender should matter more than her skill. Viktor Lazarev had been a monster, and she'd helped end his reign through 3 minutes of precisely applied violence. That was justice, cold and mechanical, delivered from the sky by someone who'd trained her entire adult life for exactly that kind of mission. She didn't regret it. She didn't celebrate it either. It was simply what had been necessary, and she'd been the tool that necessity required. The Mafia boss had claimed no one dared attack him, and he'd been right about the daring part. It took a special kind of courage to fly into a valley protected by SAM sites and armed guards, to bet your life on calculations and instincts, to commit absolutely to a course of action that offered no room for error. Alina had possessed that courage, had refined it through years of training and combat, had wielded it with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. And when the mission succeeded, when Victor's fortress burned and his empire crumbled, she'd felt not triumph but relief. Relief that she'd survived. Relief that the mission was complete. Relief that she could return to the simple, hard work of being a pilot without the weight of impossibility hanging over her head. But impossibility had kept finding her, or she'd kept finding it. Perhaps there was no difference. Perhaps some people were built to seek out boundaries and push against them, to define themselves by the limits they refused to accept. Alina had been one of those people, though she'd never thought of herself in such grandiose terms. She was just a pilot who loved flying and hated losing, who prepared obsessively and executed flawlessly, who believed that most barriers existed only because no one had tried hard enough to break them. That belief had shaped her career, had taken her from being an underestimated junior officer to being a symbol of what determination could achieve. She'd never wanted to be a symbol. Symbols were abstract, distant, carved from marble instead of flesh. She was flesh, scarred, tired, proud, satisfied. She'd lived a life of consequence, had touched the lives of countless pilots who'd learned from her example, had proven that excellence transcended expectation. That was concrete. That was real. That was enough. The A-10 that had screamed from the clouds on a foggy morning 20 years ago was still flying somewhere, still carrying pilots into combat, still proving that obsolete just meant people had stopped believing. Alina had stopped believing in limitations a long time ago. She'd learned that most of what people declared impossible was just difficult, and difficult meant you had to work harder, think smarter, be willing to try when others wouldn't. Victor Lazarev had learned that lesson too late, in the final seconds before Maverick missiles turned his fortress into a tomb. Alina had learned it early, from a father who died doing what he loved, from a career spent fighting for respect that should have been automatic. She'd earned that respect mission by mission, flight by flight, decision by decision. And now, as her career wound down and the next generation took the controls, she could finally let go of the need to prove anything. She'd proven enough. She'd flown enough. She'd been, by any measure, enough. The sky that had called to her for so many years would keep calling to others. They'd answer, some of them, driven by the same mysterious compulsion that had shaped her life. They'd face their own challenges, push their own boundaries, write their own stories of impossible missions and unlikely triumphs. And maybe, somewhere in those stories, they'd remember the pilot called Viper, who'd shown them that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle, that gender was irrelevant in a cockpit, that the only limits that truly mattered were the ones you chose to accept. Maybe they'd remember the Mafia boss who'd thought himself untouchable, and the morning he'd learned that no one was beyond reach. Maybe they'd remember the A-10 that had emerged from fog like vengeance itself, precise and terrible and absolutely committed. Or maybe they wouldn't remember at all. Maybe the specifics would fade, leaving only a vague awareness that something important had happened once, somewhere, when a pilot had refused to accept that impossible meant inevitable. That was fine, too. Alina had never flown for recognition. She'd flown because the sky demanded it, because the mission required it, because she'd been built for this, and nothing else would have satisfied the hunger in her soul. The hunger was quieter now, dimmed by age and accomplishment but never fully extinguished. She still dreamed of flying, still woke some mornings with her hands moving through phantom control inputs, still felt the ghost of GS pressing her into the seat during imaginary combat maneuvers. She always would. Flying wasn't just what she'd done. It was who she was, fundamental and unchangeable. Victor Lazarev was bones and dust, his empire scattered, his legend reduced to a cautionary tale. Alina Kovic was alive, retired but not forgot, her legacy written in training manuals and the careers of pilots she'd inspired. Their stories had intersected for 3 minutes on a foggy morning, predator and prey, justice and consequence, the unstoppable meeting the immovable and discovering that nothing was either. Then the moment had passed, the compound had burned, and life had continued. Years collapsed into memory. Memory crystallized into lessons. And lessons, when taught well, became the foundation for the next generation's excellence. That was how progress happened, not through grand gestures or revolutionary breakthroughs, but through incremental improvements delivered by people willing to push boundaries one mission at a time. Alina had pushed her boundaries as far as they'd go. She'd flown higher, faster, longer, and more precisely than most people thought possible. She'd done it while female, while underestimated, while carrying the weight of every doubt ever directed at her competence. And she'd made it look routine, because excellence should be routine, should be expected, should be the standard rather than the exception. The Mafia boss had claimed no one dared attack him. He'd been wrong, catastrophically and permanently wrong. But his error had served a purpose. It had created the conditions for Alina's most famous mission, had given her the opportunity to prove what she'd always known, that there was no such thing as untouchable, that every fortress had weaknesses, that courage and skill could overcome any defense. She'd proven it in the most direct way possible, with fire and titanium and the kind of precision that left no room for doubt. And in proving it, she'd become part of a tradition that stretched back to the first pilots who'd ever climbed into flimsy aircraft and pointed them toward danger. The tradition of refusing to quit, of finding ways when everyone said there were none, of trusting your training and your instincts when nothing else remained. That tradition would outlast her, outlast the A-10, outlast the memory of Victor Lazarev and his burning compound. It was the one truly eternal thing about military aviation, the knowledge that somewhere someone was pushing boundaries, refusing to accept limitations, proving that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. Alina had been that someone. Others would follow. The sky would keep calling, and pilots would keep answering, and the work of excellence would continue. That was legacy. That was immortality. That was enough. The aircraft screamed from the clouds when no one expected it, delivered justice with surgical precision, and disappeared back into the fog before anyone could respond. Victor never knew what killed him. He died believing in his own invincibility, and perhaps that was mercy of a sort. Better to die confident than to spend your last moments realizing that everything you'd believed was a lie. Alina had given him that mercy, though she'd never thought of it that way. She'd simply executed a mission with the same precision she brought to everything else, had put ordnance on target and returned safely home. The emotional weight, the symbolism, the meaning, all of that came later, applied by others who needed the story to mean something larger than tactics and weapons employment. Maybe they were right. Maybe it did mean something larger. But to Alina, it had always been simple. There was a mission, she was capable of flying it, so she'd flown it. End of story. Except it wasn't the end. Stories never really end when they touch something fundamental about courage and skill and refusal to accept defeat. They just keep going, passed from generation to generation, mutating slightly with each retelling but retaining their essential truth. The essential truth of the Viper strike was this: competence matters more than perception, skill matters more than expectation, and courage means acting despite fear rather than feeling no fear at all. Victor Lazarev had possessed none of these qualities. He'd been arrogant, careless, convinced that brutality and isolation equaled safety. Alina had possessed all of them, had refined them through decades of service, had wielded them with the efficiency of someone who understood that excellence was built through repetition and discipline. Their collision had been inevitable from the moment the mission was conceived. One would survive, one would not. The outcome had been determined by preparation, by who had respected reality and who had indulged in fantasy. Reality had won. It always did, eventually. You could hide from it, could build fortresses and surround yourself with armed guards and declare yourself beyond reach. But reality would find you anyway, delivered by someone who'd trained harder, thought deeper, and refused to accept that your defenses were as strong as you claimed. Alina had been that reality, incarnate in titanium and high explosive, screaming from the clouds at dawn. And when the smoke cleared and the accounting was done, the world was measurably better for her having flown that mission. That was rare enough to be worth celebrating. Most military operations had ambiguous outcomes, complex consequences, second-order effects that took years to understand. The Viper strike had been refreshingly unambiguous. A criminal was dead, his empire destroyed, his victims avenged. The collateral damage was minimal, the strategic objective achieved, the mission profile executed with textbook precision. It was the kind of operation that made planners weep with joy, and that pilots studied as an example of how things should work when everything went right. Except it hadn't been luck that made everything go right. It had been skill, preparation, and the courage to attempt something that everyone else had dismissed as impossible. Alina had brought all three to the mission, along with the kind of situational awareness that only came from thousands of hours in the cockpit. She'd seen the opportunity that others had missed, had understood how to exploit terrain and weather and the enemy's own complacency. She'd turned variables that seemed like obstacles into advantages, had made the difficult look easy through sheer competence. That was artistry, though she'd never have called it that. The Mafia boss had been a criminal, but he'd also been a symptom of something larger. The belief that power equaled immunity, that brutality could substitute for legitimacy, that some people were simply beyond the reach of justice. Alina had helped disprove that belief, had shown that reach was longer than anyone assumed, that justice could find you even in a fortress carved into mountains. It was a lesson the world kept needing to relearn, and every time someone like Alina stepped up to deliver it, civilization inched forward by another millimeter. Not much, perhaps, but enough. Always enough. As the years passed and her hair grayed and her body accumulated the inevitable wear of a life spent flying high-performance aircraft, Alina found herself thinking less about specific missions and more about the broader arc of her career. She'd been part of something important, the slow, grinding work of proving that competence transcended demographics, that the only qualification that truly mattered was ability. She hadn't done it alone. Other female pilots had fought the same battles, had earned the same respect through the same excellence. But she'd been visible, had flown missions that caught attention, had become a symbol whether she wanted to or not. She accepted that now, the weight of representation, the responsibility of being someone others looked toward for inspiration. Victor Lazarev had looked toward no one but himself, had needed no inspiration beyond his own appetite for power. That solipsism had been his undoing. When you believed you were the only person who mattered, you stopped watching for threats from unexpected angles. You stopped imagining that someone might be willing to try what you declared impossible. You stopped respecting the opposition, and that was always fatal. Alina had never stopped respecting the opposition. She'd studied every target, every threat, every mission as if her life depended on complete understanding. Because it did. That respect had kept her alive through dozens of combat deployments, had given her the edge in situations where confidence alone would have gotten her killed. Respect and competence and the humility to know that you could always learn more, always prepare better, always find another millimeter of advantage. Victor had possessed none of these qualities. His fortress had been impressive, but it had also been static, predictable, a monument to his arrogance. Alina had been fluid, adaptive, impossible to predict because she thought in dimensions that others didn't consider. That was why she'd succeeded and he'd failed. That was why his story had ended and hers had continued. The A-10 still flew because pilots like Alina had proven its worth in combat after combat, mission after mission, showing that sometimes old and ungainly was better than new and sophisticated. The aircraft had become a metaphor for persistence, for refusing to be retired before your time, for proving value through results rather than specifications. Alina identified with that. She'd never been the flashiest pilot, the one who aced academic tests or performed aerobatic maneuvers at air shows. She'd been the reliable one, the one who came back with mission complete and everyone alive, the one you wanted flying when the situation went sideways and luck ran out. That reliability was her brand of excellence, quieter than heroics but more sustainable. You couldn't be a hero every day, but you could be competent, professional, prepared. You could do the work without drama, without needing applause, driven by internal standards that exceeded anything external authorities might demand. Alina had lived by those standards, had held herself to them even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. That was the measure of true character, what you did when there were no cameras, no witnesses, no possibility of recognition. Did you still give your best? Did you still treat every mission as if lives depended on your performance? Because they did. She'd answered yes to those questions for 30 years. And when she finally stepped away from the cockpit, she'd left behind a record that spoke for itself. 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 silver stars, one legacy of excellence that would outlast her by generations. Future pilots would study her missions in classrooms, would analyze her decisions, would try to understand the thinking that had made the impossible routine. Some would succeed, would internalize the lessons and become exceptional in their own right. Others would miss the point, would focus on tactics instead of mindset, would try to copy maneuvers without understanding the principles beneath them. But that was how teaching worked. You put the information out there and trusted that the right people would absorb what they needed. Alina had done her part. She'd flown the missions, shared the knowledge, been the example that others could point to and say, "See, it can be done." If she did it, so can you. Viktor Lazarev had never been anyone's example. He'd been a cautionary tale, a lesson in hubris, a demonstration of what happened when you stopped believing rules applied to you. His compound was ash now, scattered by wind and time. In another generation, no one would remember his name, but they'd remember the mission that killed him, would remember the pilot who proved that no fortress was impregnable, no criminal beyond reach. They'd remember because the story was too good to forget. The underestimated pilot, the impossible mission, the triumphant return. Hollywood would have rejected it as too unrealistic. But it had happened, every bit of it, because someone had been willing to try. Because Alina had looked at a briefing slide marked impossible and thought, probably not. Because she trusted her training more than conventional wisdom, her instincts more than computer simulations. Because she'd been willing to bet her life on her own competence and had won. The sky above Victor's former compound was clear now, unmarred by smoke or fog, just endless blue stretching to horizons that promised nothing and delivered everything. Alina had flown through that sky, had owned it for 3 perfect minutes, had reshaped the world through precisely applied violence. Then she'd flown away, leaving the burning fortress behind, just another mission complete in a career full of them. Except it hadn't been just another mission. It had been the one that defined her, that crystallized everything she'd worked toward, that proved beyond argument that she belonged in any cockpit, flying any mission, against any target. The Mafia boss had claimed no one dared attack him. He'd been wrong about the daring, and he'd paid for that error with everything he had. Alina had dared because that was what she did, what she'd always done, what she would have kept doing if her body had allowed it. But age was undefeated, and eventually even the best pilots had to hang up their flight suits. She'd done it with grace, without bitterness, knowing she'd given everything she had to give. The missions would continue without her. Other pilots would fly into impossible situations and find ways through. The work of excellence was eternal, passed from generation to generation like a sacred trust. She'd carried that trust for 3 decades, had honored it with every mission flown, every decision made. Now it was someone else's turn to carry it forward. She could rest, finally. Could let go of the constant vigilance, the endless preparation, the weight of being responsible for million-dollar aircraft and the lives that depended on their successful employment. Could just be Alina again, not Viper, not the pilot from the legendary strike, just a woman who'd lived a life of consequence and was ready to see what came next. What came next was quieter than she'd expected. No dramatic fade to black, no triumphant final flight. Just retirement paperwork and a ceremony where they gave her another medal she hadn't asked for, and then she was civilian life, figuring out who she was when she wasn't defined by her call sign. It took time, that adjustment. Years, really. She traveled, spent time with family she'd neglected during decades of deployments, learned to sleep without dreaming of flight. But the sky still called sometimes, especially at dawn when fog rolled through valleys and she remembered another dawn, another fog, another mission that had changed everything. She'd never fly combat again. Her body wouldn't allow it, and more importantly, she'd said everything she needed to say through actions rather than words. But she could remember, could hold those memories like precious stones, turning them over in her mind, examining them from new angles as time gave perspective that the moment itself never provided. The Viper strike looked different now, 2 decades removed. Less immediate, more significant. She'd thought it was just another mission, difficult but achievable. She hadn't understood how it would resonate, how the story would spread, how future pilots would study it as proof that barriers existed primarily in imagination. Viktor Lazarev's greatest error hadn't been building his fortress in the wrong location or trusting the wrong security advisors. It had been believing that no one dared when the truth was simpler. No one had bothered, until someone did. Until Elena had looked at the intelligence briefing and seen not an impregnable target, but a solvable problem requiring unconventional thinking. That was her legacy more than any specific mission, teaching people to see differently, to question assumptions, to understand that most limitations were artificial constructs that dissolved under determined assault. She taught by example, never preaching, just flying the missions and letting the results speak. And the results had been emphatic. Victor dead, his empire shattered, justice delivered with surgical precision. The kind of outcome that made believers out of skeptics, that proved capabilities nobody had credited. The A-10 community had always known their aircraft was special. Elena had helped the rest of the world understand why. She'd shown what the Warthog could do in hands that understood its strengths and respected its limitations. She demonstrated that old and ungainly could be devastating when employed by someone who thought 3 moves ahead and never stopped adapting. The aircraft had become legendary in part because she'd been legendary. Pilot and machine, perfectly matched, each amplifying the other's capabilities. When people asked her about it, and they still did, even years after retirement, she always deflected credit to the ground crews, the intelligence analysts, the entire apparatus that made modern military operations possible. She'd just been the execution mechanism, the person in the cockpit when everything came together. That was false modesty, but it was also true. Missions succeeded or failed based on countless factors, most of them beyond the pilot's control. Her job had been to control the controllable, to maximize her performance within the constraints given, to not be the weak link in a chain that stretched across continents and involved thousands of people. She'd succeeded at that job more often than not, more often than almost anyone. That was achievement enough. The rest was just storytelling, narrative constructed after the fact to make sense of chaos. The real story was simpler. She'd been good at her job, had loved her job, had given everything to her job, and when the job was done, she'd walked away without regret. Viktor Lazarev had never walked away from anything. He'd built his empire and planned to die in it, ruling until age or violence claimed him. He'd gotten his wish, in a sense. He'd died in his fortress, just much sooner than he'd planned and far more violently. Elena wondered sometimes if he'd had any warning, any premonition in the seconds before impact. Probably not. Death came fast when delivered by Maverick missiles traveling at supersonic speeds. One moment you're sleeping in your fortified residence, confident in your invincibility. The next moment you're atoms, scattered across a compound that's transforming into rubble. No time for regrets or revelations. Just instant termination. The ultimate accountability for a life spent escaping consequences. Elena had delivered that accountability without malice. She'd never hated Victor, had never felt personal animosity toward a man she'd never met. He'd been a target, a mission objective, a problem requiring solution. Her job had been to solve that problem as efficiently as possible, minimizing collateral damage and maximizing effectiveness. She'd done exactly that. The emotional weight, the moral calculations, Those had belonged to the people who'd ordered the mission, not to her. She'd been the instrument, finely honed and precisely applied. That was what pilots were, ultimately, instruments of national policy executing decisions made in rooms they'd never enter by people they'd never meet. You could have opinions about the decisions, could disagree with the orders, but when you strapped into the cockpit, you put those opinions aside and flew the mission as ordered. That discipline was fundamental to military service. Without it, you had chaos. Alina had never been chaotic. She'd been precise, controlled, devastating when necessary but never careless. That control had defined her career, had made her trustworthy in situations where others might have panicked or freelanced. Command always knew that if they sent Viper, the mission would be flown exactly as briefed, with adjustments only when tactical situations demanded them. That reliability had made her valuable beyond her actual flying skills, impressive as those were. In a profession where egos often exceeded abilities, where pilots talked bigger than they performed, Alina had been the opposite, understated in description, overwhelming in execution. She didn't tell you what she could do. She just did it, then filed the paperwork and moved on to the next mission. No drama, no theatrics, just competence delivered with quiet confidence. The younger pilots had learned to watch her carefully, to absorb lessons she taught without knowing she was teaching. How she prepared, how she briefed, how she dealt with failure on the rare occasions it occurred. She never made excuses, never blamed equipment or luck or anyone else. She'd accepted responsibility absolutely, had held herself accountable to standards that exceeded any official requirement. That had made her dangerous to fly against and invaluable to fly with. Marcus had understood that, had appreciated her professionalism even when it made him uncomfortable. He'd known he was flying with someone operating on a different level, and he'd had the wisdom to recognize that and learn from it rather than resenting it. Not everyone had that wisdom. Some pilots had been threatened by her excellence, had found reasons to diminish or dismiss what she accomplished. She'd learned to ignore them, to focus on the pilots who wanted to learn rather than waste energy on those who wanted to tear down. Victor Lazarev had been surrounded by people who told him what he wanted to hear, who never challenged his assumptions or questioned his decisions. That echo chamber had been as dangerous as any weapon, had created conditions where reality became optional and delusion became strategy. He died because of it, killed by an attack he declared impossible because his advisors had agreed it was impossible. If even one person had challenged that assumption, had forced him to consider alternate scenarios, he might have survived. But authoritarian structures don't reward dissent, and Victor had built an authoritarian structure. The result had been inevitable, catastrophic failure at the first serious challenge. Alina had built different structures around herself, had surrounded herself with people who'd tell her the truth even when it was uncomfortable. That had kept her alive, had prevented the kind of complacency that killed pilots. She'd wanted to hear about weaknesses in her plans, gaps in her preparation, assumptions that needed questioning. Not because she lacked confidence, but because confidence without reality testing was arrogance, and arrogance was fatal. She'd seen too many good pilots die because they'd believed their own hype, had stopped treating every mission as potentially lethal. She'd never stopped treating missions that way. Even the routine ones, even the milk runs that should have been safe, she'd prepared for them with the same intensity she brought to combat operations. Because the moment you relaxed was the moment something went wrong. Murphy's Law wasn't just a joke. It was operational reality, and smart pilots respected it. Victor had been a victim of Murphy's Law, in a sense. Everything that could go wrong for him had gone wrong simultaneously. The fog had been perfect for concealment. His SAM sights had been oriented incorrectly. His guards had been rotating at exactly the wrong time, and the pilot attacking him had been one of the most competent in the Air Force. Any one of those factors might have been survivable. All of them together had been lethal. Alina had exploited those factors ruthlessly, had turned each one into an advantage, had demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that separated excellent pilots from merely good ones. She'd adapted faster than Victor's defenses could respond, had stayed inside their decision loop, had presented them with situations they weren't prepared to handle. By the time they'd understood they were under attack, the attack was already over. Mission complete, fortress destroyed, pilot extracting to safety. That was the ideal combat operation. Violent, brief, decisive. No prolonged engagement, no protracted firefight, just surgical violence applied with overwhelming precision. Alina had mastered that art form, had practiced it until it became instinctive. She'd known exactly how much force to apply, where to apply it, when to press and when to disengage. That knowledge had come from experience, from studying every mission she'd ever flown, from learning what worked and what didn't. Victor had never bothered to study anything except his own legend. He'd believed the stories told about him, had mistaken reputation for reality. That belief had lasted until approximately 0522 on the morning of his death, when the first missile had impacted his bunker and reality had reasserted itself with terminal force. The memorial park built on his compound's ruins was beautiful in an ironic way. Gardens grew where violence had ruled. Children played where guards had patrolled. The transformation was complete, the past buried under a present that had moved on. Alina appreciated the symbolism, even if she found it a bit heavy-handed. You couldn't erase what had happened there, couldn't undo the suffering Victor had caused. But you could build something better in its place, could choose creation over destruction, growth over decay. That choice mattered, it meant something. The sky above the park was the same sky she'd flown through that morning, endless and blue and indifferent to human concerns. It would outlast the park, outlast the memory of Victor Lazarov, outlast her own legacy. That was comforting somehow. Individual lives were brief, but the sky was eternal. She'd spent her life flying through it, leaving no lasting mark except in the minds of people who'd watched her work. That was legacy enough, more than enough. The Mafia boss claimed no one dared attack him, and he came screaming from the clouds. And the rest, as they said, was history. Incomplete history, sanitized and simplified, but history nonetheless. The truth was more complex, more human, more interesting. But truth often was. Alina Kovic, call sign Viper, pilot of impossible missions and symbol of determined excellence, had lived that truth every day of her career. She'd flown when others wouldn't, had succeeded when failure seemed certain, had proven that competence transcended every boundary people tried to impose. That was her story. That was her legacy. That was enough. The sky remained, waiting for the next generation to answer its call. They'd come, as they always did, drawn by the same mysterious compulsion that had shaped her life. And maybe, when they flew their impossible missions, they'd remember the pilot who'd shown them it could be done. Or maybe they wouldn't. Either way, the work would continue. Excellence would endure. And somewhere in a foggy valley or over a distant battlefield or in training missions that tested the limits of ability, another pilot would push boundaries and prove that impossible was just another word for not yet attempted. That was the real victory, the one that mattered more than any individual mission. The proof that human capability, properly trained and fearlessly applied, could overcome any obstacle. Victor Lazarov had been an obstacle. Alina Kovic had been the capability. The outcome had been inevitable from the moment they'd intersected. The fortress burned. The pilot flew home. And the world learned once again that no one was beyond reach.